In the previous videos, we have looked at how we can derive the IS and the LM curve in an open economy. And so I hope that at this stage, you do have a very good understanding of how we can derive the IS and the LM curve in an open economy, and also have a basic understanding of what balance of payment line mean. We don't really have to get into how we can derive the balance of payment curve and line and how does it make sense. Just have a brief understanding of what balance of payment line stands for. Essentially, we assume that we draw an imaginary straight line, assuming a position where balance of payment is equal to 0 or cancels out, and that is essentially represented by the balance of payment line. In this video and in the upcoming few videos, we'll discuss how the capital mobility can impact the different levels of government output, given that we have different exchange rate, given that we have different government policies. But before we can start our analysis, there are a few assumptions that we make. The first assumption that we make is that the domestic interest rate is equal to the international interest rate, at least in the very long run. This is because we assume that the country trading is a small country. Now, what does a small mean in this situation? Small essentially means small in terms of trading, trading volume. So we make an assumption that if a country is small in terms of its trading volume, no matter what the interest rate they set in the economy, in the long run, because of market forces and because of international pressures, the interest rate would come to the international level or whatever the international interest rate is in the long run, at least. So we make this assumption that in a perfectly mobile capital situation, the domestic interest rate is the same as the international interest rate. In reality, there are time lags, there are time delays, and for that reason, the capital is not perfectly mobile. But for the sake of argument, we are making an assumption in this analysis. So let's say the government implements expansionary fiscal policy. Let's say the government increases its government spending. So what's going to happen? We know from our basic understanding that is going to cause our IS curve to shift towards, let's see if I can draw that. That is going to cause our IS shift curve. That will cause the IS curve to shift towards the right. So what is the reaction? The reaction is that will set a new equilibrium point of, let's call this point y1, and we would have a new interest rate of R1. Keep in mind, this interest rate is our domestic, let's call it RD, domestic interest rate. We are making an assumption initially that the domestic interest rate and the international interest rate is essentially the same. But if the government implements expansionary fiscal policy, it's going to cause the, let's call it fiscal policy, is going to cause the IS curve to shift towards the right, and that would create a new equilibrium point R1 and Y1. The income level in the economy would increase. So what would be the reaction? We are making an assumption that we are here in a fixed exchange rate system. So if we think about it intuitively, if we have an increase in government spending and if the domestic interest rate increases, RD is greater than R star, what's going to happen? If the domestic interest rate is greater than the international interest rate, the international investors or foreign investors would try to pool their money into this economy because they see, hey, these people have a higher interest rate. So if I were to invest in this country, I would have a higher rate of return relative to if I were to invest in some other countries. That will incentivize them to invest in the domestic economy. Therefore, that is going to cause capital inflow. And that makes sense intuitively, mathematically also, because if you think about this equation, if R is greater than R star, what's going to happen? The value for K is going to be positive. That would imply that we have a capital inflow. What's going to happen next? We also see that when we have a capital inflow, there will always be an appreciation of the currency. Why? Because if I'm a foreign investor and I see that a country has a higher rate of return to my investment, I'm going to demand more of their currency. So demand for currency would increase, and given that everything else is constant, the currency would appreciate. Because we assume that this is a fixed exchange rate, the government would not want the currency to appreciate. The government would want the currency to stay fixed. So what would the government do? The government would intervene. And they would create an increase in money supply in their exchange rate. How can they do that? They can do that by buying. So if they buy foreign currency, so let's say if they buy dollars, so if I'm a foreign investor and if I invest my money into this country, The country's government could buy my dollars and put it into their foreign reserve, store it essentially in their reserve, and they could sell their own currency, let's say their own currency is in a pound, and they could sell their own, no, it's not right, pound. Let's say we're talking about the Chinese yuan. Okay, and they could sell their own currencies, and this would imply that this would imply that the LM curve would shift towards the right. So let's say the LM curve shift towards the right, something like that. Okay, and essentially the government is trying to do that, so just so that we can bring our interest rate or bring our currency back to its fixed position. Let's call this LM2. So what is the reaction? What is the consequence? Well, as you can see that the income level in the economy would further increase, but our interest rate in the long run would come back to its original position. That makes sense intuitively because we assume that the country is small. So this will cause our income to go from Y0 to Y2. To summarize it again, whenever the government implements fiscal expansionary policies by increasing government spending, domestic interest rate would increase relative to international interest rate, at least in the short run. You have to keep that short run in mind, because in the long run it would come back to its original position. That is going to cause a capital inflow, because investors would see greater return to invest in this particular currency, in this particular economy, and that would cause the economy or the currency of that economy to appreciate. And because this is a fixed exchange rate, the government does not want that. The government wants the currency to stay fixed. So in order to keep the currency fixed, the government would have to intervene by increasing the amount of money that they have on the exchange rate market. Keep in mind, we are considering only the international market in this situation. We are not talking about the domestic market. The government would increase the supply of its money in the domestic market by buying US dollars and keeping it or storing it in their reserves, and by selling their own domestic currency, and that would cause the LM curve to shift towards right, and that would cause the income in the economy to increase from Y0 to Y1. So the overall effect is that we see that the income goes from Y0 to Y2, and for this reason we say that this is a very effective government policy, given that we have a fixed exchange rate system. And you can look at it vice versa. What if the government tries to increase its taxation? Whatever we have discussed over here, essentially we are going to inverse it. If we have increase in taxation, the IS will shift towards the left. The domestic interest rate would be less than the international interest rate, and that would imply that we have a capital outflow instead of having inflow. That would imply that we have a depreciation of the currency, and because this is a fixed exchange rate, the government would have to intervene by selling US dollar and buying the yuan, and that would cause the LM curve to shift towards the left, and our income in the economy would decrease. Again, we can just take the same theory and flip it around if we are talking about the increase in taxation. So whether we have a expansionary fiscal policy by increasing government spending, or we have a contractionary fiscal policy by increasing taxation or decreasing government spending, the net output is that we see that there is a substantial effectiveness of this policy. Now let's talk about monetary policy. What's going to happen if government tries to implement monetary policy? Let's say the government is implementing expansionary monetary policy. If the government implements expansionary monetary policy, we know that from our basic understanding of the ISLM curve. Make sure you have watched all the previous videos just so that you have a clear understanding of what is happening. So the LM curve will shift towards the right because we have an increase in money supply in the economy. What's going to happen as a result? As you can see from the analysis, that our income in the economy is going to increase, at least in the short run, and the interest rate in the economy, the domestic economy, is going to decrease in the short run. So what's going to happen as a consequence? When our let's say the money supply increases, that will cause our LM curve to shift towards the right, and that shifting towards the right would create let me see if okay, in this situation, that is going to cause our domestic interest rate to decrease. So domestic interest rate would be less than the international interest rate, and what's going to happen as a consequence, when the LM curve shifts towards right, we know that our income would go from Y0 to Y1. When the interest rate in the economy decreases, we know that intuitively speaking and also mathematically, we will have capital outflow. Why is that? As you can see from the equation here, if our international, if our domestic is less than the international, the value for k is going to be mathematically in negative numbers. When the interest rate decreases relative to the international interest rate, mathematically and also intuitively, we will have capital outflow. Why would we have capital outflow? Because if I'm an investor, I will see that internationally the interest rate is higher. So why would I want to invest in my own country where the interest rate is small? I would have greater rate of return in other countries. So I would try to invest my money abroad. I would take my money somewhere else. So we would have capital outflow. The money would flow from the domestic market to the international market, and that also makes sense intuitively. We think about the equation: k is equal to, or capital in the economy is equal to your domestic interest rate subtracted by the international interest rate. So if the domestic interest rate is lower, we would have a negative level of capital, which would imply that we have capital outflow. So what's going to happen as a result? So what's going to happen as a consequence? We know that whenever we have capital outflow, our currency is going to depreciate. In some textbook they use the symbol pi for currency, but I'm going to use the symbol e just for simplicity. The currency is going to depreciate, and because we assume that this is a fixed regime, this is a fixed exchange rate, the government would not want that to happen. The government wants to keep a stable rate of exchange rate. So the government would have to intervene into the market. And how can the government do that? The government can intervene into the market by the government can implement a lot of different techniques here, but the most common one is that the government is going to use a foreign exchange reserve. The government would use a foreign exchange reserve to reduce the amount of currency they have in the market, and they can do that by many different ways. They can do that by selling the US dollars and buying their own currencies, or they can just directly reduce the amount of currencies that they have in the exchange rate market. That is going to cause a decrease in the supply of money. That's going to cause a decrease in the supply of money in the foreign exchange market. That would cause the LM curve to essentially shift backward and theoretically essentially go back to the same equilibrium point. So if this was y0 to y1, we would go from y1 back to y0, coming back to our initial equilibrium point where r is equal to r star. So we would say that since we have no improvement in the income level economy, this policy is deemed to be ineffective, in the economy. This policy is, because we have no improvement in the income level, we say that this is a ineffective policy to try to influence the income level in the economy. So hopefully this does give you a brief understanding of what happens to the income level given a fixed exchange rate regime when we have fiscal and monetary policies implemented. Just understand that whenever we have a monetary policy implemented, it is going to be very ineffective, especially when we have an expansionary monetary policy. And if we have a expansionary fiscal policies, income level in the economy would increase. And just like fiscal policies, you can look at it in an inverse way. What if the government tries to implement contractionary monetary policy? Whatever we have discussed here, we are just going to flip it around. Everything will be reversed, and overall we would still have the same reaction, in the sense that the income in the economy would remain the same.